Welcome to the Visionary Chronicles, a business strategy podcast where we provide insight to those looking for creative, executable strategies built around the latest disruptive ideas, innovative cultures, product creators, and marketing solutions. Today in the Visionary Chronicles, we're going to talk about an issue almost every company, brand went through during this pandemic. And not only through the pandemic, but prior to the pandemic, I'm sure a lot of them felt the foundations cracking, and that is in their supply chain. And what I'd like to talk about today is just some innovation, some things we talk about, the supply chain innovation, how to strengthen your weaknesses. And a lot of these brands, many of these companies prior to the pandemic, many of them knew they had issues with their foundation even before the pandemic hit. So when the pandemic struck, many companies were forced to address their supply chain. And what they found was a weak foundation, and many times in need of repair long before the pandemic. So when we work with companies at Liquid Mind, what we find are weak points in that foundation. And what we were finding with companies that had supply chain issues was they didn't identify the weak points that needed repair long before the pandemic hit. So the good side of it is that it forced these companies to make changes to their supply chain. The bad side of it is, and what we found is that many times it was too late. You know, maybe not too late to have the company survive or not, but many times too late in the process where it didn't cause disruption in their supply chain and inevitably with their retailers and with their consumers. So what we found is this innovation that was needed, but a lot of them ignored it until it was too late. So this was a good and bad scenario we found with many of the companies. So this forced these companies to address their supply chain constraints and just manage through the pandemic as best they could. And coming out the back end, or even as we see kind of a light at the end of the tunnel here with the pandemic, is they kind of came out licking their wounds with both their consumers and their retailers. As we know, as the supply, which we had in this case, the supply dwindled, but demand increased. And that was something I can tell you from a predictability perspective, from an operations standpoint, and the models that we put together was the biggest challenge for every brand. So if you've gone through this, and if you are in this situation, what I'm telling you is you're not alone. We literally have hundreds of companies that have gone through the same issues that you're going through on the supply chain disruption. And fortunately, for the most part, the retailers as well as the consumers have been accommodating as long as the information you're providing is accurate. And what I mean by that is I've had many brands that say one thing and then do another. And what it does is it compounds the issues with both retailers and consumers. We have found in the studies that consumers are very understanding, retailers a little bit less, but both understand the situation. Where it becomes a major problem with your supply chain and the communication to both consumers and retailers is where it's continually changing. You don't have a good grasp on where everything is in regards to your sourcing, the LDP pricing, where it may be from a time frame standpoint, and when it's going to actually be in store or in the hands of the consumer. So there's a lot of frustration out there on both sides of the fence. So when we look at this, we say, well, there's a strategy and a process. And again, it goes back to where are we at today? What are the issues that we're facing? Those that take a logical approach to evolving their supply chain, trying to innovate, finding ways that not only through this crisis, but understanding long-term provides a competitive benefit for them over their competition. So this is really a strategy that needs to be not only defined, but one they put in place. And the crises that we're going through was just an opportunity for them to not only start the evaluation, but also implement the strategy going forward. So what we found is that the strategy that a lot of these brands went through, deployed in many instances, was effective. So while the supply chain was moving, it was effective. The problem is when it stopped, it proved deadly. And many of the strategies put in place were, for example, a great example is lean manufacturing. It's still an effective process, but it needs additional foundational pillars built around this structure to ensure that when things do go wrong, when the supply chain does get disrupted, the interesting thing is you can call disruption an innovation, or you can call disruption something negative. So you got a positive and a negative on disruption. In this case, it's a negative for supply chain disruption. But when you have a lean manufacturing technology, you're assuming a constant flow of components. And when that stops, the entire food chain stops. So when you look at what do you need to build around this lean manufacturing model that many manufacturers, if not all, have implemented, and when you get into a situation where you have the supply chain being disrupted, what I say is that when we look at this structural foundation of lean manufacturing, there are other pillars that need to be built around that. Such as enhanced sourcing, alternative contractors, geopolitical constraints that you need to move away from that are not impacted or impacting your supply chain. So these are numerous challenges, but there are structural foundation and pillars you can put around this lean manufacturing and supply chain innovation strategy that are effective. They may be in some cases a little bit old school, but certainly it allows you to overcome what has now become a major problem and a disruption in our industry. So while consumers in our environment today expect quick turn product and demand lower pricing, what's a brand to do without losing its competitive edge? And that is a challenge because lean manufacturing was built around making sure that you're balancing inventory against demand. And it was an effective and continues to be to this day, an effective strategy for brands and one that should continue to stay intact and in place. But when you get into a situation like we're in today, where that gets disrupted, everything along that food chain becomes an issue because then everybody's fighting over components. Everybody's low man on the totem pole. Nobody wants to be the last one to receive the first in line product. So it's very similar to a gas shortage where everybody wants gas. So everybody's lining up, but there's only one pump. So you're getting that right now with the chips, the semiconductors. You're getting that with components on CPG product. So it doesn't matter where you turn. Everybody is now impacted by the supply chain issues. So lean manufacturing has always been this kind of pinnacle of supply chain, and it still is. But I found that there are ways that you can continue to have supply chain innovation and just asking questions and ensuring that you have a process to address this issue going forward. So some of the things that we looked at, and there were really 5 principles that we looked at. There's probably many more, but we found these to be the priorities when we worked with our brands to ask these questions when you put them up on the board. And number 1 in that question chain is risk ID. Identifying the potential risk associated with your supplier, or your contract base, let's say. And some of the issues you'll see or things you put up on the board on risk ID are narrow production skill set and outsource increase component risk from outsourcing, and making sure that you're, let's say, mapping out that entire risk ID scenario and making sure that you've got layers of fail safe, let's say. And when I was in the aerospace industry, and they continue to use it today, is what they call fail safe. So it's something that's a replicated process. So if one process breaks down, the other one kicks in. So very similar to the risk ID we're facing today is those that really had the highest exposure to risk ID in this marketplace that had a very narrow production skill set, meaning that those that they were contracting with didn't have the ability to take over outsourced component risk. So what you want to make sure of is that you get a broad production skill set and the ability for them to be able to broaden that skill set when you need product when there's a disruption like we're going through today. So things you need to look at would be bandwidth sourcing, making sure that whoever you're working with, you're a priority and you have the flexibility of having an increased bandwidth skill set with those contractors you currently work with. So when you're going through a crisis, make sure that you're number one in the food chain with that contractor you're working with, that you properly train that contractor to have a narrow skill set that can move to a broad production skill set. So if you need to outsource these components, you can bring these in-house to a particular contractor and squeeze that timeline. So making sure that these risk assessment, this risk ID is one thing that you identify very early on. Now, there's not much you can do in the very beginning, but going forward, you can identify that risk ID, single sourcing, country, geopolitical, narrow contracting base with a narrow skill set, and identify those and be able to strengthen that weakness on a high risk ID scenario. The second thing we looked at is, for number one is risk ID. Number two is your chain map. And what we mean by that is mapping your supply chain. I mean, I don't mean from a particular country. I don't mean from a component level. What I mean is from beginning to end, how you source, why you source in a particular location, risk assessment on a geopolitical standpoint, as well as a component risk level and bandwidth standpoint. So all of these things from beginning to end, from IDing potential weak links in your overall production sourcing, is key to your success. So if you find that you have weak links, make sure that you correct these or reinforce these weak links where needed. So as you move along in your production, that you don't get hit with what we call in the industry on the consumer product side is never hold up a shirt for a button. That's what's happening in this industry right now. There could be a product that's 95% done, but because of a subcontractor either not having the skill set or bandwidth to be able to produce that button, you can't ship that shirt. So having this chain map is extremely important. So risk ID, chain mapping, and then number three by itself is sourcing. So when we talk about the sourcing, the word that always comes up and very few take it to heart is diversification is key in many areas, but in particular with sourcing. Find alternative sourcing, not only from a core competency standpoint, but also from a geopolitical, geographical standpoint. Many brands in this industry were stuck with single source contractors within a country where there were geopolitical risk and or bandwidth or any type of risk ID issues they had to deal with on the sourcing side. So what we talk about here is replicating sourcing, but not just from a country perspective, but also from a competency standpoint. So when you look at your sourcing model and you're going to chain map this out, risk ID it, the sourcing is the third pillar in identifying the supply chain innovation and how to strengthen these weaknesses. Sourcing should be that one that's the reinforcements that says, I can move from point A to point B. I can expand point A, increase its bandwidth because I've trained them to do additional skill set products and I can move this secondary source over to my primary contractor. So there's all kinds of solutions you can find on the sourcing side. But one thing I feel that most of the brands we work with don't do is what we call this fail-safe strategy from the aerospace industry is replicate, and making sure you're overlapping sourcing in different regions with the same competency. So the fourth point is we go through risk ID, chain mapping, sourcing strategy is what I call loose and lean. And I go back to saying that lean manufacturing is the pinnacle of where most brands have gone. It's component manufacturing, keeping a lean inventory level, quick turn inventory, with the goal always being increased inventory turns and demand never outstripping supply. That's the goal. But when it happens is that the machines on the production line are turning and the wheels are turning, that works great. But when we get into a situation where we've got disruption, it becomes a major problem. So continuing with this lean process, but what I call adding some fat to this lean process. The rainy day will come, and it's best to have an umbrella when needed. So what I say is keep some safety stock, making sure that you look at your lean manufacturing, your increased inventory turns. I think that's all great, but you want to make sure that you loosen what I call lean and add some fat. So that's a piece of what we talk with on the sourcing side, and it's a complement to everything we're talking about here on supply chain innovation and ensuring that, again, you're still competitive, but supply will never be less than demand. So what I call number 4 is loose and lean. Number 5 is technology, innovations, finding ways to improve process flow, upgrade to production efficiencies that allow for improved cost, quick turn, and increased competitiveness. And as a result of this, and these 5 pieces of this puzzle, when we talk about supply chain and innovation, how to strengthen these weaknesses, all 5 of these strengthen one another. And when working in conjunction, builds a rock-solid supply chain process. And the last one, when we talk about those tech innovations, is that's a continually evolving supply chain innovation technology, meaning that finding ways to always innovate in your processes. And this is where people start talking about moving back to the United States, sourcing in different countries. Technology becomes a bigger piece of that discussion than it was before. There are some countries where labor is the primary cost of a product, where others, it's the technology itself that allows you to reduce your costs. So whatever you do in your supply chain, this is an opportunity through this pandemic, kind of by force, to look at your supply chain, making sure that you look at your vulnerabilities, do your risk ID, chain map out, sourcing development, loose and lean, and tech process improvements and innovations. These are all areas that, if put into a process where it's continually evaluated, you don't get what we call rust on the machine. You want to make sure that thing's a well-oiled machine, and these are the 5 points that you need to put in place in order for that to happen. I wanted to thank you for listening to the Visionary Chronicles podcast, and hopefully you find the information that we put out each week very useful. And what we found through reviews and when we were originally putting together their Visionary podcast was found both personal and professional advice as well as information those listening to the podcast were looking for. So we wanted to be unique in that way, and hopefully you found that to be the case. And appreciate the reviews that you've been sending in, and we would certainly appreciate you signing up for our newsletter as well, which is an expansion upon what you're seeing on or hearing on the Visionary Chronicles podcast. And you can find that at 2 locations. One is bryansmeltzer.com, eltzer.com, or our company site, liquidmindsite.com, liquidmind site, site.com. So we would appreciate any reviews, additional reviews, comments you may have. Sign up for the newsletter, and we look forward to talking with you next week.